And welcome back to America Can We Talk. I'm Debbie Georgatos, and again, so thanks so very much for tuning in to my show, America Can We Talk. As I mentioned before the break, we have a guest joining us this hour. I believe we have him online. You know what? Had a little trouble with our guest last week.
Yeah, we got him.
We got him. Okay. And I was just notified by one of our listeners that when I'm holding his book up for you to see on Facebook Live, it's backwards. Sorry about that. The book is called The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. Stellar book. And I believe we have Mr. Robert Spencer online. Hello, sir.
Hi, Debbie. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Just great. Thank you. Okay.
I must tell you that I don't know if you know this feeling, like when you go to a museum and it's the most informative, amazing museum ever, and I've done this. I had this feeling in art museums and history museums. I wish I could memorize every detail so that when I walk out the door, I can remember it all. And that's exactly the feeling I had looking through, and I didn't memorize your book, but looking through your book, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. It is so fact-packed of just recounting the history of jihad and just in the words, in many cases, of people who recounted in their journals of what happened. So to start with, congratulations on the book. And then second, why did you write it?
Thank you very much. I much appreciate your kind assessment. And I wrote it because it didn't exist. You remember the guy who wrote The Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger. Whatever you think about The Catcher in the Rye, I always remembered something that I read that he had said once, and that was all the books he had written were books that he wanted to read, but they didn't exist. And so it was up to him to write them. And so this is actually the case of why I wrote this book. There is no other history of jihad. There are histories of jihad against Europe. Those are not so hard to find. But history of jihad that encompasses India, encompasses all of the rest of the world, this is something that has never been done before, and this is the only book that does it.
It is truly, listeners, it is just a stellar book, and it's organized very logically by time over the centuries. And one thing I didn't know what you were going to say about why you wrote it, and I'm thrilled that you did. Should be a textbook for students to read. But one thing that occurred to me that ever since 9/11 happened, and in America, and a lot of people really didn't have any familiarity with Islam, didn't recognize or know anything about jihad. And a lot of what people thought was that whatever happened on 9/11 probably happened because we, America, did something wrong. This was retaliation for something bad we did, because they had no concept of the long historical conquest ideology of Islam.
Yeah. This is one of our biggest weaknesses, actually, as a nation, is that we don't have a historical sense, and people don't know. People tell me all the time, when I was growing up, and this is certainly true of me also, we didn't have this kind of thing with people blowing themselves up and stabbings and people running people over and so on. These kinds of things didn't happen. We never heard about Islamic terrorism in the 70s and the 80s, and this is true. But one thing that I show in the book is that there was certainly a spell in which it was not happening because the Islamic countries were weak and not able to pursue it. It wasn't because there was a reformation, a rejection, a reconsideration of the doctrines that gave rise to it. Those have always existed, and as I show in the book, for 14 centuries, Muslims have acted upon them. And so what we saw starting in the latter part of the 20th century, and very much in the 21st with 9/11 and everything else, is a resurgence of a 1400-year war that has been pursued all over the world, wherever Muslims and non-Muslims have lived together.
It's just, exactly. And, I wasn't very familiar. In fact, I even took not a minor, but a lot of classes in comparative religion in college, and I never had anyone say that there was Islam was presented kind of like one of the great world religions and X% of the world, and, there was no sense, even in your trying to be in-depth in college studying religions, that there was woven into the founding of it, or by the founder of it, this notion that conquest in the name of converting people to Islam is permissible. I think most people still don't know that.
Right, absolutely. Well, there's certainly been a deliberate campaign of disinformation and misinformation that has kept many people from knowing it. The last chapter of the book is called The West Loses the Will to Live, and it starts with 9/11 and then goes immediately to George W. Bush in the mosque 6 days after 9/11. he went to a mosque in Washington. He was standing in front of Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who was later imprisoned for being a financier of Al-Qaeda, and he said Islam is a religion of peace. And so this is an extraordinary situation. You have the President of the United States, right after a major jihad attack, going to a place to say that the motivating ideology behind the attack is not really what it was, and standing there with somebody who helped finance the group that pulled off the attack. It's an astonishing story, really.
It's an astonishing story. I had a line I was going to say to you about the name of your chapter 10. It is "The West Loses the Will to Live." I was going to say that's the only chapter I disagree with your title, because I know that we seem to have lost the will to live, and that we have many actors who are failing to recognize the threat. But through the work that you do, and Frank Gaffney at Center for Security Policy and others, I think there's a resurgence of the will to live. I think more people are waking up. But maybe you feel differently. Do you think America's waking up to the threat more and more?
Yeah, actually, it's true. I still title, of course, I wrote the book late last year and early this year, and I did title it that now. But I'm actually much more optimistic than I was in, say, 2015. Certainly the election of the president and the Brexit vote, many good developments in Europe are showing that people are waking up. But it's still also, unfortunately, true that the political and media elites in both Europe and the United States are dead set against basic measures that we need to take to survive.
Absolutely. And I mentioned in the last segment, I was talking about a different topic, but I mentioned that Brad Anderson, executive, he was a former CEO of Best Buy, who simply made a donation to a group that put commercials out that people viewed as Islamophobic. My point being, the militancy of some defenders of Islam in America is truly strident and kind of shocking. I mean, they drove Brad Anderson off of 3 or 4. Are you familiar with that at all? Drove him off of 3 or 4 boards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't surprise me at all. Just today, on my website, Jihad Watch, I had news about a group called Ex-Muslims of North America. Now, the Islamic Society of North America, which is a group with ties to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, is having its annual convention right now in Houston, Texas. And so this group, the Ex-Muslims of North America, went to Houston to the hotel across the street from the conference with wearing T-shirts saying, "I'm an ex-Muslim, ask me why." They were sitting in the Starbucks at the Hilton across the street from the conference, peacefully drinking coffee and chatting with each other, and they were ordered off the premises and told that they could not be there unless they changed their shirts. This is America in 2018, and that's why I called it "The West Loses the Will to Live." Yeah.
The story you just recounted, this is up on your website? Is that right?
Yes, it is. Jihadwatch.org.
I was going to say, you founded Jihad Watch. I love that. It's a great site for listeners to go to and read some of the stories about the threat of jihad, because this idea that he's describing, it's not just that individuals assert that Islam cannot be insulted, but they co-opt people like whoever ran the coffee shop across the street. It's like some people in authority take the side of those trying to protect Islam as a victim class and really apply standards they wouldn't apply to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what the Islamic advocacy groups and their leftist allies have very skillfully done since 9/11, and actually starting before then, is portray Muslims as a victim class, subject to persecution, harassment, and discrimination in the United States, which is not really the case.
Now go ahead.
Hate crimes against other groups are far more common than hate crimes against Muslims. No hate crimes against anybody is justified, but the idea that Muslims are under some kind of threat in the United States, that's an appalling falsehood that is politically motivated, manipulative, and designed to interfere with counterterror efforts.
And it silences criticism. Speaking of that, we only have about a minute left in this segment, but I mentioned in an email ahead of time, if you've been following this story that in England, a member of Parliament, Boris Johnson, put out a blog post essentially saying, related to some of the countries in Europe are passing bans on burqas. And his thing said, look, I don't think you should ban them because it's up to the individual what they want to do. But he made some, what they felt was insulting references to the way women look with those, with a covering up everything but their eyes. And he's now being investigated. And there's a complaint filed with Theresa May saying essentially he should be told he has to stop talking. Have you followed that at all?
Yeah, the Conservative Party, so-called, of Britain, actually has threatened to send him to re-education camp to that sensitivity training, they call it. And I think Boris, however, is very canny because there's tremendous frustration and anger in Britain today. There is nobody who is speaking out for the people, the many, many ordinary British citizens who are deeply concerned about what's going on in the country and about the consequences of mass Muslim migration into Britain. And so Boris, by saying this and refusing to back down, actually is, for the first time, giving these people a representative.
He absolutely is. So I got to jump in. We're going to be out of time in this segment. I'm so sorry. Robert Spencer, love your book, The History of Jihad. Thank you so much for calling in. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we got to cut it short. Thank you, sir. Be right back.